Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Vector live from San Francisco.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello everyone and welcome to another exciting episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host Vaughn Smith and today we're going to be exploring the wonderful world of object-oriented Python. And in this episode we're going to be going over the installation and the setup and everything we need to know to get started coding with this fantastic language. And here to help us on this fantastic journey is Mr. Justin Dennison. Hello Justin, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Vaughn. How are you today?
I'm super excited to be here and learn all about this Python thing we're talking about today.
Yeah, Python. Not talking about a snake. I'm scared of snakes, actually.
Me too. I'm glad we're not doing snakes.
So yeah, if there's a snake here, I'm running away. So yeah, Python. We've covered some other things in the course library. If you haven't checked out our Intro Python series, definitely check that out because there's some assumptive knowledge here. But we are going to make sure there's setup because a couple of things may have changed. Some of the environment may have changed. So that's kind of where we're going to start. Is just the installation and setup. So.
All right. Cool. Well, before we actually get started with that, I've heard some things about Python and numbers. There's like a 1, 2, 5, 8. Where are we at? Where are we starting?
So that is a great question, Vaughn. So we started out so Python 1 came around, it was early edition, and then slowly we moved to Python 2, and people really gravitated to the Python 2 version. It had some nuanced differences from Python 3, which is now the preferred version. So we have Python 2 and Python 3, and they're still both distributed. And that's what's really confusing to a lot of people who are just starting, or maybe you're like, I know a little bit of Python, but it's always been available to me. Like the environment's set up for me, I haven't really had to worry about that. So we're going to focus on Python 3, and in particular, anything that is 3.5 or higher. So if you're watching this video at a later time, then if it's above 3.5, assuming that it's not version 4 by that time, that shouldn't be for a while now, then you should be okay with everything we're going to use in this series. But just remember, if you somehow get Python 2, 2.7 is the last one, you need to be aware, if you get used to that, in 2020, the Python organization, like the main Python consortium, they're going to sunset it. No more updates, no more security updates. It is no longer supported after 2020. So you should definitely, even if you start in Python 2 or you should start moving to Python 3. So how are we going to get Python 3 on our system, right? Let's assume I have a system, it's brand new. If you have a Linux system or an OS X, a Mac system, then a lot of times you already have Python installed, but be wary. A lot of that has to do with system tools that use Python behind the scenes, and that may be a Python 2 distribution. But if you do not have it, then we got to install it. There's several ways to install it on Windows, Mac, Linux, and various other operating systems. But what I find to be helpful, just to get everybody all together, is to use the official distribution. So if we hop down into my screen here, so I'm on python.org, which is the official distribution, the like organizing body. Zoom that in a little bit, it's a little hard to read. So this tells you all about Python, including documentation. But notice, if I go to documentation, it has a 3.xdocs and a 2.xdocs, right? Anything that is version 3 is listed here, anything that is version 2. And typically it's the most recent minor version. So it would be 2.7 and then 3.6, if I'm not mistaken. May have to double check on that. But we also have downloads, and notice it has detected that I'm using Mac. But all of these other platforms are available to us. We have Windows, OS X. Let's look at other platforms. Let's just see what's available to us. AS400, BOS, more. I don't even know some of these. So Python is very well supported, and that's good to know because it's kind of a level playing field for all of us. But the first thing we need to do is just grab this binary installer. If I click it, then it starts installing. Now, we're using the CPython distribution for this course. That's the standard one that's available from python.org. That's when people think of Python, that's a lot of times what they normally go to. But that is not the only distribution that is available. You may hear of alternative distributions like Anaconda or Enthought Canopy. Those are actually CPython distributions that provide tools to help manage like external packages or come pre-bundled with all of these extra helper pieces of software for Python. But also there's other versions of Python like Jython. So if we take a look here while that's downloading, so we have the Jython project. And it's kind of been dormant for a while, but I still hear people talk about it, ask about it. And what Jython is Python written kind of on top of Java, which is another programming language. And that's kind of weird. You can actually use Java stuff from within Python. But this is not, we're not using this one because it has kind of a special use case. So be aware. There's also IronPython, which is Python for the .NET platform, or that's the C# Visual Basic .NET, those type of programming languages. It then uses that kind of runtime under the covers. We are focused on CPython. And why is it called CPython? Well, that's because the underlying interpreter is written in C. It's just the C programming language, kind of abstracted away for you to use Python. So be careful. Different distributions, we're using python.org. But I do see that my installer, it's done. It's actually fairly small. And if I click it, you may have a little bit different kind of screen other than I do. I'm on OS X. You'll see something similar to this. If you are also on OS X, if you're on Windows, you'll see something a little different. But if I hit continue, 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 do I agree? I do agree. Where do I want to install it? On the only hard drive I have. And then I'm going to click install, and you will have to give elevated permissions in order to install Python. It writes out a few files, and in just a moment we should be up and ready to go. Now we will test this shortly, but this, I just wanted to show you, it's fairly simple to get this installed, up and going. So we're going to be programming in Python, which involves writing code. But that's kind of weird.
Okay, so great. So the first step for us to do is to install Python on whatever operating system that we're using on our computer. All right, so the next step is we're going to start actually typing in the code or the programming language that we're using, correct? So where do we do that?
So that's a great question, Vaughn, and there's several places that I can go to manipulate text, right? I will forewarn you, don't open Microsoft Word or anything like that and try to type. You will have a very bad experience. It involves lots of crying and kind of being frustrated. So we can't have that, but if we hop down, I'm just going to review a few text editors that are available. There is the Atom editor, so at atom.io. This is a rich text editor. It doesn't provide anything else than some management tools, a plugin ecosystem, so I can kind of give it upgrades, and then syntax highlighting for Python. This will actually be the one that we use, and we'll take a look at it in just a moment. In the same vein, a very popular one is Sublime Text. This is available. It works well. It's very similar to Atom. It was kind of the first to the game with this rich text editor paradigm. Well, not first to the game. It's one of the first ones that I used. There were some others that came before. But it has some wonderful features. Definitely check it out. And then also, Microsoft has started putting out Visual Studio Code, which is similar to Atom, but uses some of their own like code completion, syntax highlighting tools. Very wonderful. On top of just these plain text editors where you have to do some additional setup, and how much you have to do of that depends on the text editor. We have IDEs. So I have an IDE called Spider. This is for scientific Python. You'll notice it gives you a giant list here of installing on Windows, installing on Mac, installing on Linux, running directly from source. Well, this one could be a little iffy, but there's not a lot of pictures. I don't know. It seems to have a very particular use case. I've used it for some scientific programming that I've done, but I don't use it all of the time. But there's also Pycharm, which is from JetBrains. It's a kind of an all-inclusive IDE. And you can see Python IDE for professional developers. There are two versions of Pycharm. There's Community Edition and Professional Edition. Community Edition is free. It is not as feature-rich as the Professional Edition. Professional Edition does have a cost, but this will have everything bundled together that you would need to manipulate your Python code. Syntax highlighting, code reformatting, actually being able to run by just clicking like a play button. And then along those same lines there is Wing, which was kind of a good competitor to Pycharm in the IDE space. But if you've ever messed around with other programming languages, Eclipse, NetBeans, some of those, as well as Visual Studio, the full-featured one, which is only available on Windows, also have Python plugins that you can use to develop your Python code. But you know, those are kind of heavyweight, so we may not get into using those during this time.
So Justin, if you don't mind me asking, what does IDE stand for?
Vaughn, sometimes I get so excited about this, I forget that I'm just throwing out jargon and lingo. So IDE is an integrated development environment. So that means everything that I need for development, including the runtime environment, the text editor, all the other tools for debugging and things, are kind of just packaged all together in this nice, neat bundle. But you caught me, Vaughn. Thanks for getting me on that.
So it's really just like a text editor on steroids, a little
Yeah,
bit. So
yeah,
it has a lot more.
Yeah, it's a text editor up to 11.
Okay,
So-
and it doesn't matter which one you choose to use. You could use just a plain text editor or the IDE. It's really whatever you prefer, whatever environment that you prefer to work in.
That is a wonderful kind of synopsis of where we've come from. I've shown you some choices. These are not exhaustive choices. But you said something very important, a plain text editor. That's where it gets you. A plain text editor means I'm not adding any additional formatting. If you have custom file extensions like .doc or .docx or .odt, those are kind of encoding some formatting and all of these nice styles in that text file. If you try to write Python code, or any code for that matter, in those, you will not have a good time. Whenever you try to compile or run it, it'll just go, no, I don't know what you're saying. But we're going to use a plain text editor, and we're going to learn a little bit about the command line, just enough to be dangerous.
Okay, great. Sounds wonderful.
So we have our text editor. Let's take a look at which one we're going to use here. If you want to download Atom, then you can click download it will auto recognize what operating system you're on. I'm on Mac. It's not huge, but it's about 90 megabytes. So it may take a little while, depending on your system, to download. But it's a simple one-click install. On Windows, you click install, and it kind of does its thing, and you're done. On Mac, you just open it up and drop it in the applications folder. So I'm not going to take you through that. But when you open it up, you will have something that looks like this. So not much going on here, right? But if I say File, New File, it will open up an editor. And it's just a simple cursor. And let's zoom that in. I like my text really large on my text editor. Some people make fun of me. They're like, do you have a hard time seeing? Well, actually, if you program a lot, as I have, you don't like tiny text. It just puts strain on your eyes. My default text setting is like 24-point font, so it's in your face big. But if I can just type, it is plain text. With this file, though, it is not a Python file. So how do we get that? Well, we actually have to save it. And what I like about these rich text editors, even though they're saving simple, just plain text, well, they're able to recognize what syntax highlighting, what kind of file this should be by the file extension. So let's just go ahead and save a test.py, and that's important. Let's zoom in here. If I can get it to zoom in, there we go. Notice I put .py in these editors like Sublime and Atom. You have to put the file extension. It does not assume a file extension for you like some of those other text editors that are made for Office applications. So if I type test.py, and I'm just going to save this on my desktop, you will notice I have some plugins that automatically detect, and they go, oh, you need to do this. And also it opened up the folder that contains that file over here on the left, and I have some folders on my desktop. There's some hidden files there that it will show. It does not ignore hidden files like your normal compute solution would, right? If you go in the Finder, I don't see this .ds store, this .localized in the desktop folder. But in Atom, it will show you everything unless you work around on the settings and preferences to get that to change. So we're actually ready to write some Python code, but I feel like we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. How are we going to run this? Well, we're going to use the command line in conjunction with with this text editor. So where can I find a command line on my system? Well, all available well, let me rephrase it. Let me back up just a little bit. I'm making a pretty strong assertion there. When I say all, I'm saying most. I have to be careful there. Most current OSs, operating systems, have something like this. For Windows, it's PowerShell or Command Prompt. For OS X, you have the terminal application. So if I search for terminal in Spotlight, I will actually get a terminal application. Now I use a replacement one, so I'm going to close this out, and all it is I'm a little bit nerdy. I like to have some custom styling and things like that. So I use another one called iTerm. It is the exact same environment, other than I can do some customization that's not available. So terminal and the one I'm using, the same thing. So if you're on a Mac, just search for terminal and it opens up and you see kind of old school computing going on. We've removed the GUI. It's all good to go. So I'm going to zoom that in, open that up. That's on a Mac. What about Linux? Well, depending on your flavor of Linux, it'll have different names. Sometimes it's named terminal, terminal emulator, Xterm emulator, command prompt, command line. So you have to do a little poking around, but the icon will be very similar to what I have down here, and I can't get that to zoom quite like I want it to. There we go. So it'll look kind of just like a box, like an old school computer prompt. So let me see if I can get that over here. I can't get that to move, Vaughn. I cannot get it to move.
Lex, where's that?
Yep. All right, here we go. Aha.
There we go.
There we go. So it'll look just like a regular kind of computer box. And a lot of times it has the cursor actually in the icon. So you'll have to find that on your machine. You open it up, and then you'll either have a blinking icon or a non-blinking icon. It depends on the setting. And we should be ready to go. We've installed Python, and we should be able to test to see if Python is installed. So we installed it earlier in the episode, but we never actually tested it. How do we test that? Once you've gotten to the command line, I can type Python, and here's where it has to be tricky. I know on my machine, I have an OS X machine, and on Linux-based machines, if you type Python, a lot of times there will be a system-level Python 2.7. So Python 2 is still there. Well, that's not the one we want to use, but now we're in this, how do you get out of this? Well, when in doubt, Control-C, right? When in doubt, Control-C. Okay, that doesn't work. If Control-C doesn't work, then Control-D typically brings you out. So those are command line things that we should know. I'm not going to ask you to do a whole lot with these, but we will need to know a little bit around this terminal environment. So I typed in Python. I was expecting that 3.6 that I installed, but it's not there. Well, that's kind of weird. If you have a system where Python, typing the normal Python phrase, or word, not phrase, phrase would be multiple words, and hit enter, and you see a version number that you're not expecting, that means there's one residing there that your system's using. You may need to try adding a 3 to this. Let's zoom in a little bit more here. And if I type Python 3, I now have that 3.6 installation that I just installed. So if you have 2 versions, a lot of times it'll be Python and Python 3. Now, this varies depending on your system. How do I know which one it is? Sadly, you're going to have to explore a little bit, just use the old search engine incantations to see if you can figure out which one is what. And usually people are really helpful. That's what I like about the Python community. Incredibly helpful community. They will not leave you hanging. So there's typically something there. But now where are we at? We're in the REPL. Let's play around in the REPL, see how this works out. So I'm going to type print hello. And notice there are quotes there. And boom, my Python has executed. Well, that's good to know.
So Justin, I heard another acronym.
Uh,
REPL? What? REPL? What?
yeah,
What was that?
Vaughn, you keep catching me with throwing that jargon around. I'm going to learn one day. I'm going to learn one day. REPL.
I'll keep you in check.
Yeah, I appreciate that. REPL. Read, evaluate, print, and loop back. So it reads in whatever I type. It evaluates it if it is a valid expression, if it's valid Python in this case. It will print out the result, and then it will loop back to the read. Okay? So it reads, it evaluates, it prints the results, and then it goes back to the beginning.
And that's exactly what we just did in this command line. We were testing it, we were seeing if it sees it, and it printed out hello. And so now we know that we're in business.
We're ready to go. We got to be careful. We're dangerous now. So we have our command line environment up and going. Hopefully you've been able to find it. We've been able to print out a very simple command. If you wanted to, you could use this as just a calculator. 2 + 2 is 4. That's valid. But do keep in mind, if you type something crazy, right, like that, and you hit enter, you'll get a printout of an error. That's not valid, so things will go awry. But notice it doesn't die. That doesn't get you out of the REPL. Remember, how do I get out of this? That's a good question. When in doubt, Control-C. Well, Control-C, nope. Backup plan, Control-D. And that will get you out of the Python REPL. So that's how you could play around. And this is something that I do a great deal in Python is I'll just hop into the REPL, try out some things, see if it works, and then I go and code it. So this experimentation code, experimentation cycle is something that I employ a great deal. But there's a second thing that we need to know. How do we actually write, we have this Python, this test.py file. How do I get that to run? Like, that's different than playing around in the REPL. So I'm going to print in the file, okay? I do want to highlight a common difference. In Python 2, print did not have parentheses and was actually handled in a very special way. In Python 3, it is technically a function, and you have to have the parentheses. So we're in Python 3, you will see all Python 3 stuff. If you are not getting this to work, then things will go horribly awry for you, and you have to again search engine incantations to go figure out what's going on. But that's an important skill to have, so don't be afraid, don't get frustrated, don't quit. I have valid Python. I just tested something out very similar to this in the REPL. How do I make this run now? Well, when we have that file I have saved, be careful that you've saved. Do you see a little blue dot here in Atom or in Sublime? Well, I think in Sublime it's a white dot, but you haven't saved. I can run this file all I want. If I haven't saved the updates, it will run the old version that has not been saved yet. So you'll get weird output. Be careful about that. So how do I run this? Well, I need to get to that file within the command line. So where am I? Well, if I type ls, that's something that I do a great deal. I'm in my home directory, which most, whether it's on Windows, Linux, or OS X, you start in a directory for your user account, what you've logged onto the computer. I remember that I saved that test.py file on the desktop. So I need to hop into the desktop folder, just like I would click by opening Finder or Windows Explorer. And how do I get there? Well, let's see if we can cd, which means change directory. Change directory will allow me to double-click a file, essentially, and go into that file. And then if I type ls now, I have this test.py. How do I run that file? Well, if we type just Python or Python 3 in this case, so we're going to have to be careful. We will get weird results if we forget that 3. I'll go into the REPL. But how do I run this file? Well, Python 3, and then the name of the file that you want to run. It will slurp that file in and execute from top to bottom. And notice that it prints out in the file, and that's exactly what I had in the file. So we've seen how to run in the REPL. We've seen how to execute a file. We've learned a little bit about the command line, and we'll learn a few other things to navigate through this command line interface as we need them. But I think we have our text editor set up. We have Python installed. We can run Python. We have the right version. We're in the command line. I think we're good to go. We should be all set to start down this object-oriented Python path that we've set out before us, Vaughn.
Well, thank you, Justin, for all that great information, and thank you for clearing up those acronyms. I know I always like to know what those acronyms stand for. Even if I don't remember them, at least I've heard them once. So that's it for now. Thank you so much for tuning in and signing off for IT Pro TV. I'm Vaughn Smith.
And I'm Justin Dennison.
See you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.